The silence in Chairman Kang Min-Jae's Seoul office was heavy, a clinical vacuum that smelled faintly of expensive floor wax and old power. He sat perfectly still, his tailored black suit uncreased despite the late hour, leaning slightly forward with a posture of relaxed but dominant authority. Before him, a wall of monitors bathed his sharp jawline in a rhythmic, red neon pulse, mirroring the glowing skyline of the city outside his window. His eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on a grainy, high-definition feed originating half a world away in the heart of the American Midwest. On the screen, Park Ji-Hoon moved through the crowded, gold-lit interior of the Black Crown Sanctuary. The spy's movements were fluid, professional, the perfect, unstable variable caught between two giants. To any other observer, Ji-Hoon looked like a man in control, a high-end investment broker blending into the charismatic chaos of Malcolm Carter's empire. But Kang saw the sweat beading on the young man's forehead, the way his brows furrowed in a flicker of anxiety and fear. Kang took a slow sip of tea, the steam rising in a thin, controlled line. He was the chess player, and Ji-Hoon was the knight. He had moved deep into enemy territory to checkmate the man they called the Black Crown. Suddenly, the feed flickered. A violent glitch tore across the monitor, a digital scream that disrupted the clinical silence of the Seoul office. Kang's eyes narrowed, his expression remaining a mask of controlled tension even as his pulse quickened. This wasn't a hardware failure. This was a breach. On the monitor, Ji-Hoon stopped walking. He didn't look at the guards or the sprawling luxury of the club. Instead, he turned slowly and looked directly into the pinhole camera hidden in his lapel, directly into Kang's eyes. The split red and blue lighting of the club's hallway carved Ji-Hoon's face into a mask of betrayal. "He's waiting for you, Chairman," Ji-Hoon whispered. His voice was steady, stripped of the nervousness Kang had seen only moments before. The screen went black. Kang didn't move. He didn't reach for the phone or call for his security detail. He simply stared at his own reflection in the darkened glass. The arrogance that served as his greatest strength, the belief that Malcolm Carter was merely an impulsive, charismatic thug, began to feel like a weight. He had assumed he was the only one playing with grand strategy, failing to see that the quiet superiority Carter projected was backed by a mind just as calculating as his own. In the darkness of the office, a single light on Kang's desk began to blink. It was a private, encrypted notification from his board of directors in Korea. He tapped the screen, expecting a routine report on logistics or market shares. Instead, a list of his own personal offshore bank accounts appeared, the balances scrolling down to zero in real time. He realized then that this wasn't just a failed mission, it was a coup. The board members he thought he controlled had been moved like pawns by a hand he hadn't even seen. Malcolm Carter hadn't broken the spy with torture. He had broken the chairman's foundation with a better offer. Kang stood up, his silhouette framed against the red neon city he thought he owned. The strategic war had truly begun, and for the first time in his life, the chairman realized he had moved the wrong piece. He reached for his coat, the coldness in his eyes replaced by a burning, focused fire. If Carter wanted a war of shades of gray, Kang would give him a masterpiece of shadows. The hum of the server racks in Chairman Kang Min-Jae's private sanctum was the only sound in a city that usually screamed with ambition. He sat before a sprawling digital map of the American Midwest, his eyes tracking the logistics of a ghost empire. To Kang, the geography of Detroit and Chicago was not made of asphalt and steel, but of vulnerabilities and entry points. He adjusted his silk tie, the red neon of Seoul bleeding into the simulated gold of the American grid on his screen, his posture remaining that of a man who had never lost a game of positioning. He monitored the Black Crown territories with a clinical detachment, viewing Malcolm Carter not as a sovereign king, but as a temporary occupant of valuable real estate. In Kang's mind, Carter was no different from the Russian syndicates he had dismantled back home, loud, visible, and ultimately expendable. He watched the data packets from his trackers move across the screen like ivory chess pieces, convinced that Black Crown was merely another Russian, to be shut down through superior capitalization and silent infiltration. His board of directors had cautioned him about the shades of gray in American street politics, warning that loyalty there was as thin as the paper it was printed on. Kang had dismissed them with a sharp, controlled glance. He believed in the clean and marked nature of power. If you owned the debt, you owned the man. He viewed the local law enforcement as a variable to be bought and the local drug lords as friction to be smoothed over with the right amount of candy. To Kang, Carter was a quiet boy who had simply been lucky enough to operate in a vacuum that the Korean syndicate was now prepared to fill. The chairman pulled up a satellite view of a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit. It was a hub for Carter's distribution, a nerve center that radiated the charismatic dominance his intelligence reports frequently mentioned. Kang allowed himself a subtle, cold smirk. He wasn't interested in the street-level heat or the body count that seemed to define American crime. He was interested in the architecture of the operation. He saw the flawless taste in how Carter ran his business, but he also saw the gaps where a spy like Park Ji-Hoon could slip in unnoticed, like a slow leak in a heroin bag. They think they are playing a game of checkers in a boardroom, Kang whispered to the empty room, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He tapped a command on his console, authorizing a massive transfer of funds to a series of anonymous tips and shell companies designed to choke Carter's supply lines. He didn't need to fire a single bullet yet. He would wait for the biggest moment of tension to arise naturally from the financial vacuum he was creating. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, the chairman watched the American market open. The numbers fluctuated, a digital heartbeat that he intended to stop. He viewed the entire continent as a chessboard where the rules of hospitality were about to be rewritten. He was certain that by the time he stepped foot on American soil, the Black Crown would be nothing more than a memory, another failed enterprise discarded in the dumpster of history. He closed his eyes for a momentary rest, unaware that across the ocean, the man he considered just another Russian was already holding a phone to his ear, listening to the chairman's very breath. The transition from the sterile, neon-lit corridors of Seoul to the heavy, gold-drenched atmosphere of Malcolm Carter's inner sanctum was a shift in both temperature and soul. Park Ji-Hoon stood in the center of a private lounge overlooking the Detroit skyline, his reflection split by the red and blue emergency lights of a passing patrol car far below. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke suit, maintaining the clean facade of a high-end investment broker specializing in international capital. He was the unstable variable in this room, a piece moved by Chairman Kang to dismantle an empire, yet his brow remained dry despite the controlled tension vibrating through his frame. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and the quiet superiority of a man who wasn't worried. Malcolm, Black Crown Carter sat across from him, draped in a fitted black shirt that shimmered under the warm golden lighting of the lounge. He didn't look like a drug lord. He looked like a man who had already won. Carter's posture was upright and assured, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he flipped through a digital portfolio Ji-Hoon had prepared. To the chairman back in Seoul, this was a simple infiltration of a Russian-style thug, but Ji-Hoon could feel the charismatic dominance radiating from the man across the table. "You talk about diversification like it's a religion, Mr. Park," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that lacked any sign of aggression. "Most people come into my city looking for a handout or a war. You're the first to come with a spreadsheet." Ji-Hoon offered a practiced, deferential nod, playing the role of the strategic intelligence operative to perfection. "Chairman Kang believes that the modern market doesn't have a dark side or a light side, Mr. Carter. It only has shades of gray. We see your operation not as a series of street corners, but as a series of untapped assets." Carter leaned forward, the thick gold chain around his neck catching the light. He studied Ji-Hoon with eyes that seemed to see through the clean markings of the broker and into the heart of the spy. It was a strategic war, and Ji-Hoon felt the weight of the wrong piece moving in the back of his mind. He was here to find the leaks, to see if Carter was using the same mule tactics the Russians had once employed, harvesting the desperate and discarding the remains. "I like your style," Carter finally said, closing the portfolio with a soft thud. "You have flawless taste for a man who claims to be all about the numbers. My board of directors, they're old-fashioned. They like to see the muscle before they trust the mind. But me? I prefer the chess player." Ji-Hoon felt a flicker of anxiety, a furrowing of his brow that he quickly suppressed. The mention of the board of directors was a sharp needle. He was here to monitor them as much as he was to spy on Carter. He had been sent to ensure no one was cleaning out the chairman's accounts, yet here was Carter, inviting him into the very circle he was meant to destroy. "I appreciate the hospitality, Mr. Carter," Ji-Hoon replied, his voice steady. "I think we have 2 or 3 good years of growth ahead of us if we align our interests now." Carter laughed, a sound that felt more like a warning than a welcome. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, pushing one toward Ji-Hoon. "Trust me on this, Ji-Hoon. By the time we're done, you're going to find your true calling." As Ji-Hoon took a sip, he felt the heavy gaze of Carter's security detail, men who stood like stone, waiting for a single screw-up. He was in. The infiltration was a success, and the clean, marked money of the Korean syndicate was beginning to flow into the Black Crown's coffers. But as he looked at Carter's assured expression, Ji-Hoon wondered if he was the one doing the spying, or if he was simply the latest asset being harvested by a man who was always very clear about his intentions. The private dining suite atop the Black Crown's flagship estate was a masterclass in psychological atmospheric design, bathed in a warm, golden radiance that felt more like a cage than a welcome. Park Ji-Hoon sat across from Malcolm Carter, the fine bone china between them clinking with a delicate, clinical precision that reminded him of the surveillance rooms in Seoul. Carter remained the picture of quiet superiority, his posture upright and assured, a man who moved through his own world without a hint of the impulsive violence Chairman Kang had predicted. He looked like a man who wasn't worried, even as he systematically dismantled the clean facade Ji-Hoon had worked so hard to maintain. "You don't eat much for a man with such a high-stress portfolio, Mr. Park," Carter remarked, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. He cut into a piece of rare steak with a slow, deliberate grace, his thick gold chain catching the flickering light of the candles. Ji-Hoon offered a controlled, calculating smile, though sweat began to bead invisibly beneath his hairline. "I find that a light appetite keeps the mind sharp for the chess moves of the morning market, Mr. Carter." Carter paused, the silver of his fork hovering in the air. He leaned slightly forward, his expression shifting into something more focused, more predatory. "Chess. That's what the chairman calls it, isn't it? He thinks he's the only one who knows how to move the pieces. He thinks I'm just another Russian to be shut down by a suit with a spreadsheet." The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen was being harvested by the man across the table. Ji-Hoon felt the furrowing of his brow, the unstable variable of his loyalty wavering under the weight of Carter's assured gaze. He realized then that this wasn't just a dinner. It was a golden trap, a strategic war where someone, likely him, had just moved the wrong piece. "Chairman Kang has high demands," Ji-Hoon replied, his voice a shade thinner than he intended. "He expects his investments to be respected." Carter laughed, a dry, rhythmic sound that lacked any warmth. "Respect is a word for men who don't have the upper hand. But tell me something. Ji-Hoon is a fine name. Very traditional. Very Seoul." Carter leaned in closer, the smirk on his face growing sharper, more dangerous. "But I wonder if you prefer the name your mother used before she owed? Or perhaps the one you used when you were fending for yourself on the streets before the chairman found you?" The clinical silence of the room was shattered by the revelation. Ji-Hoon's heart hammered against his ribs, his controlled tension, threatening to snap into pure, unadulterated fear. Carter didn't just know his mission. He knew his soul. He had bypassed the flawless taste of the broker and reached into the dark side of the spy's history. "I don't know what you mean," Ji-Hoon whispered, though the lie felt heavy in his mouth. "I think you do," Carter said, his voice dropping to a whisper that mirrored the spy's own anxiety. "I know who you are. I know who sent you. And I know that your chairman's board of directors is already taking my candy. You're no quiet boy, Ji-Hoon. You're a runner. And you're running out of time." Carter stood up, the golden light casting a long, dominant shadow over the table. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't need to. The trap had already closed. "Enjoy the wine. It's a 1998. The year your chairman thought he could own the world." He was wrong then, and he's wrong now. As Carter walked away, leaving Ji-Hoon alone in the shimmering gold of the suite, the spy realized the shock Kang was about to receive would be total. The hunter had become the prey, and the chessboard was being flipped by a man who had never intended to play by the rules. The clinical silence of Chairman Kang Min-Jae's private command center was anchored by the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of liquid-cooled processors. He sat encased in a tailored black suit, his posture a study in dominant authority as he leaned toward the sprawling array of monitors that mapped his global interests. His eyes, cold and focused, tracked the digital heartbeat of his American operation with the strategic intelligence of a master chess player. To Kang, power was a matter of visibility. If he could see the Black Crown territories, he could dismantle them. The first sign of the shadow glitch was a microscopic tear in the live feed from Detroit. A single pixel strobed neon red, then vanished. Kang's jawline remained defined and controlled, though his eyes narrowed as he adjusted the frequency of the encrypted satellite link. He suspected a technical short in the system, a mundane hardware failure at the Foxtrot node, or a glitch in the local surveillance property. He had always prided himself on flawless taste in technology, believing his systems were as impenetrable as the high-ranking board of directors he supposedly controlled. "Reset the secondary uplink," Kang commanded, his voice a low, steady vibration that filled the vacuum of the room. "I want it fair and square. No one cleans us out like this." But the system did not respond. Instead, the red neon of the city skyline on his monitors began to bleed into a warm, sickly golden hue, the signature lighting of Malcolm Carter's inner sanctum. The digital map of the Midwest began to dissolve, the interconnected supply lines unraveling like a frayed silk tie. Kang felt a rare flicker of controlled tension as he realized this wasn't an equipment failure. It was an invasion. The shadow glitch accelerated. Every hidden camera Ji-Hoon had planted, every wiretap into the Black Crown's logistics began to feed back a single, looping image. Carter's face, etched in a subtle, assured smirk. The drug lord looked directly into the chairman's surveillance apparatus with a quiet superiority that suggested he had been the one watching all along. Kang's high-tech room, once a fortress of strategic intelligence, now felt like a cage of mirrors. "It's not a glitch," Kang whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "It's a hijacked signal." The monitor to his far left suddenly surged with data. It wasn't surveillance footage, but a series of internal ledger entries from the Korean syndicate's own board of directors. The bank accounts he had monitored so carefully were being drained in real time, the numbers tumbling towards zero while a digital crown, Carter's mark, flashed over every transaction. His arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that an American thug could possess hackers capable of tearing through Korean encryption. Kang stood up, his silhouette casting a long, dominant shadow against the flickering screens. The chess moves he had planned were being rendered obsolete by a man who didn't play by the rules. The room was losing oxygen, the clinical atmosphere replaced by the anxiety and fear that usually belonged to a spy. Malcolm Carter wasn't just defending his territory, he was harvesting Kang's digital soul. As the last monitor went dark, leaving the chairman in total shadow, a final message scrolled across the main console in elegant, gold-lit script. "Your muscles make you slow, Chairman. Let's find out how you handle the dark." For the first time, the chess player realized he was no longer looking at the board, he was trapped inside it. The flickering neon red of Chairman Kang Min-Jae's office felt colder than usual, the clinical silence of the room now heavy with the metallic tang of impending disaster. He sat behind his desk, a master chess player waiting for a report from the front lines, his posture dominant even in the face of the shadow glitch that had recently plagued his systems. When the encrypted notification finally chimed, a sharp, digital pulse, Kang leaned forward, his eyes cold and focused. He expected the definitive proof of Malcolm Carter's drug distribution network, the evidence needed to finally shut down the Black Crown. The file that materialized on his screen, however, was not a map of American stash houses or a ledger of street-level transactions. Instead, Park Ji-Hoon had transmitted a series of high-resolution scans that made the chairman's defined jawline tighten in a rare display of controlled tension. The documents were not Carter's. They were Kang's. They were internal Korean syndicate contracts, dated and stamped with the chairman's own digital signature, agreements for the surgical implantation of heroin bags into mules recruited from the very villages Kang claimed to protect. The first shock was not the discovery of an enemy's crime, but the exposure of his own rot. Kang stared at the screen, his strategic intelligence momentarily paralyzed. These were clean and marked deals he had authorized under the guise of logistics, believing the details were buried beneath layers of corporate shell companies. But Ji-Hoon, the spy he had trusted as his most stable variable, had unearthed the truth. The chairman's board of directors hadn't just been taking Carter's candy. They had been documenting Kang's personal involvement in the organ harvesting and trafficking ring to use as leverage. "He's not just a drug lord," Kang whispered, his voice a low vibration of burgeoning fury. "He's an archivist." The realization that Carter was the unexpected equal became a physical weight in the room. Carter hadn't intercepted the file. He had given it to Ji-Hoon to send. It was a move of quiet superiority, a signal that the Black Crown didn't need to fight a war in the streets when they could win it in the chairman's own boardroom. Every signature on those mule contracts was a bullet aimed at Kang's heart, a shock designed to dismantle his territorial dominance before he could even board a plane to Detroit. Kang watched as a second file began to download, a list of the young women currently in transit, their lives reduced to line items on his own balance sheet. The unstable variable had finally tipped the scales. Ji-Hoon wasn't just a spy anymore. He was a witness. The chairman looked at his hands, realizing they were stained with the same dirty greed as the mayor he had so casually looked down upon. The strategic war was no longer about territory. It was about survival. Malcolm Carter had moved the wrong piece, but it was Kang's own piece that was now holding the knife. The warm golden lighting of Malcolm Carter's private study felt like a physical weight on Park Ji-Hoon's shoulders, a stark contrast to the clinical, red neon chill of the Seoul office he once called home. He stood by the window, the Detroit skyline shimmering like a fractured jewel, while sweat beaded on his forehead in the heavy silence. In his pocket, the phone felt like a live wire. On it was the file he had sent to Chairman Kang, the mule contracts that proved his own mentor was just as dirty as any street-level thug. Ji-Hoon's brows were furrowed, his expression a mask of anxiety and fear as he realized he was the unstable variable caught between two giants. Malcolm Carter sat at his mahogany desk, his posture upright and assured, radiating a quiet superiority that suggested he already knew the contents of the spy's heart. He didn't look like a man worried about the strategic war unfolding around him. Instead, he watched Ji-Hoon with a subtle smirk, his gold chain catching the light as he poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. "You look like a man searching for a light side that doesn't exist, Ji-Hoon," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. "You thought you were the clean one, sent by a clean chairman to fix a messy city. But now you've seen the signatures. You've seen the shadows." Ji-Hoon turned, his face partially lit in the split lighting of the room, symbolizing his dual allegiance. "Chairman Kang told me there was no dark side or light side. He said there were only shades of gray. I just didn't realize he was the darkest shade of them all." The realization was a shock that transcended tactical espionage. It was a crisis of soul. Ji-Hoon had spent years believing he was part of a superior, strategic intelligence, only to find that he was a pawn for a man who harvested lives for profit. Yet, looking at Carter, he saw the same charismatic dominance that demanded its own kind of blood. Both men were chess players, and both saw the world as a board where people were moved, used, or discarded. "So, what do you do now?" Carter asked, leaning forward with an upright, confident posture. "Do you run back to the man who lied to you, or do you stay with the man who showed you the truth?" "It's a strategic choice, Ji-Hoon. But move the wrong piece, and the game ends for everyone." Ji-Hoon felt trapped between the chess player in Seoul and the unexpected equal in Detroit. His loyalty was a frayed silk tie, snapping under the pressure of his new reality. He thought of the young women in the contracts, the mules whose kidneys were being fried by the very heroin they carried. If he stayed with Carter, he was aiding a drug lord. If he returned to Kang, he was serving a monster. "I don't have a side," Ji-Hoon whispered, his voice trembling with controlled tension. "I'm just a runner who's tired of fending for himself." Carter stood up, his presence dominant and his expression assured. "Then stop running. In a world of gray, the only thing that matters is who's holding the umbrella when it starts to rain." As Ji-Hoon looked from the phone in his hand to the man across the room, he realized his dual allegiance wasn't a choice between good and evil, but a choice between two different kinds of darkness. The strategic war had become personal, and the spy knew that whichever way he turned, he would be leaving a trail of betrayal behind him. The amber liquid in the crystal glass remained untouched as Park Ji-Hoon stood in the warm golden lighting of the black crown study, his shadows stretching thin across the mahogany floor. Malcolm Carter leaned against the edge of his desk, his posture upright and assured, radiating the quiet superiority of a man who had already seen the end of the game. He watched the spy with a subtle smirk, his gold chain catching the light as he tossed a thick, encrypted tablet onto the desk between them. "You keep looking for a reason to stay loyal to Seoul, Ji-Hoon," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "You think Chairman Kang is the grand architect, the chess player who holds the strings of his board of directors. But an architect is only as good as the foundation he builds on. And your chairman? His foundation is made of sand and greed." Ji-Hoon's brows were furrowed, his expression a mask of anxiety and fear as he reached for the tablet. His fingers, usually steady from years of strategic intelligence work, trembled slightly as he swiped through the data. It wasn't a list of drug shipments or street-level body counts. It was a ledger of wire transfers, massive, untraceable sums flowing from Carter's offshore accounts directly into the private holdings of Kang's most trusted board members in Korea. "This is impossible," Ji-Hoon whispered, his face partially lit in the split red and blue lighting that symbolized his fractured allegiance. "These men have been with the chairman for decades. They are high-ranking, they are family." Carter laughed, a dry, rhythmic sound that carried no warmth. "Family is a business term in your world, kid. I didn't have to torture them. I didn't even have to threaten them. I just offered them candy that was sweeter than anything Kang could provide." He stepped closer, his charismatic dominance filling the room until the air felt heavy. "I've been paying them more than your chairman ever could." While he was busy playing the mastermind, his own people were selling him out to the man they call a thug. The realization hit Ji-Hoon with the force of a physical blow, a shock that left his defined jawline tight with controlled tension. He saw the signatures, the clean and marked approvals for the very mule contracts he had discovered earlier. The board hadn't just been taking Carter's money, they had been feeding Carter the evidence of Kang's crimes to ensure their own survival. "He's just as dirty as you, Ji-Hoon," Carter said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper that echoed the shades of gray of the city. "Your chairman, his board, the mayor of the city, they're all part of the same organ-harvesting, soul-crushing machine. The only difference is I'm the one holding the remote now." Ji-Hoon looked at the screen, seeing the faces of the men he had respected, now reduced to line items on Carter's payroll. The strategic war was no longer about territory or market dominance. It was a fire that had already consumed the house from the inside. He was the unstable variable, but he realized now that he was standing in the middle of a room that had already been gutted. "So, what do you do when the chess player realizes his own pawns have been working for the opponent the whole time?" Carter asked, his expression assured and his posture dominant. Ji-Hoon looked up, his eyes meeting Carter's in the warm golden light. "The game doesn't just end," he replied, his voice a low vibration of burgeoning betrayal. "It changes." Carter's smirk widened. "Exactly. And I think it's time we let the chairman know his board has been cleared." The clinical silence of Chairman Kang Min-Jae's private office in Seoul was broken only by the persistent, rhythmic vibration of an encrypted smartphone on a glass desk. Kang sat perfectly still, his tailored black suit uncreased, his posture a study in dominant authority. He watched the screen as the caller ID, a a secure line from Detroit, flashed, and then went dark for the 10th time that hour. His jawline remained defined and controlled, but his cold eyes were fixed on the map of the American Midwest, where the digital pulse of his most loyal weapon had flatlined. Ji-Hoon, Kang whispered, the name a low vibration in the empty room. He had moved this piece across the global chessboard with the strategic intelligence of a mastermind, certain that the spy's history of fending for himself would ensure a false sense of loyalty to the man who found him. But the silence from the other side of the world was a shadow glitch he couldn't explain away as a technical short. This was a defection, a deliberate severing of the tether that bound the unstable variable to the chairman's hand. Kang leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he realized the magnitude of the shock. He wasn't just losing a spy, he was losing his eyes and ears in a territory where the Black Crown already held the upper hand. He thought of the file Ji-Hoon had sent, the mule contracts with his own signatures, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. His weapon had been turned into a witness. The clean and marked world he had built was hemorrhaging, and the man he viewed as an impulsive Russian was the one holding the scalpel. Across the ocean, in the warm golden lighting of a safe house, Park Ji-Hoon watched his own phone screen go dark. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his brows furrowed in a mask of anxiety and fear as he stood trapped between two giants. He could hear the charismatic dominance of Malcolm Carter in the next room, a man who didn't need to use mule bags to exert control because he already owned the chairman's board of directors. Ji-Hoon felt the weight of the shades of gray pressing in on him. He was no longer a chess player, just a runner who had finally stopped running for the wrong side. Kang stood up, his silhouette casting a long, dominant shadow against the red neon of the Seoul skyline. The strategic war was no longer something he could manage from a distance with clinical detachment. He felt the heat of the betrayal, a dirty realization that his own board was likely laughing as he dialed a number that would never pick up. The chairman realized then that he had moved the wrong piece, and the consequence was a total loss of control. Find the next flight to Detroit, Kang commanded his assistant over the intercom, his voice stripped of its usual calm masterminding and replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He would not wait for the next move on the board. He would face the Black Crown and his traitorous weapon in person. The chessboard was broken, and the only thing left was the biggest moment of tension before the final outcome. The cabin of the private jet was a vacuum of clinical, pressurized silence as Chairman Kang Min-Jae crossed the threshold of the Pacific. He sat encased in a tailored black suit, his posture relaxed yet dominant, even as the red neon of Seoul was replaced by the cold, starlit void of high-altitude transit. He was the chess player moving himself into the heart of the shades of gray, determined to handle things with the strategic intelligence that had built his empire. To Kang, America was a territory of dirty mayors and impulsive thugs, a Russian style of chaos that he intended to shut down personally. As the wheels touched down on the rain-slicked tarmac of a private airfield outside Detroit, Kang adjusted a silk tie, his jawline defined and controlled. He expected to land as a ghost in the machine, a silent predator arriving to purge a traitorous board of directors and a disloyal spy. He had instructed his security detail to maintain absolute source anonymity, believing his arrival was a clean secret. However, as the hangar doors slid open, the clinical atmosphere of his plan was shattered. Instead of an empty terminal, Kang was met with a warm, golden radiance that spilled across the wet concrete. Standing at the foot of the air stairs was not his own transport, but a fleet of black SUVs adorned with the stylized Black Crown emblem. Malcolm Carter stood in the center of the light, his posture upright and assured, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he watched the chairman descend. He wore a thick gold chain that caught the glare of the landing lights, radiating a quiet superiority that suggested the chess player had been played. Beside him stood Park Ji-Hoon, the spy's face partially lit in the split red and blue lighting of the sirens, his expression a mask of anxiety and fear. "Welcome to Detroit, Chairman," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried easily through the damp air. "I heard you were coming to check on your investments." It's a shame your board of directors didn't tell you they'd already invited me to the welcome party. Kang halted on the final step, his cold eyes focusing on the unstable variable that was once his most loyal weapon. The realization hit him with the force of a shadow glitch. His arrival hadn't just been leaked, it had been scheduled. Every strategic move he had made was being mirrored and anticipated by the man he once viewed as a mere thug. The arrogance that served as his greatest flaw had led him directly into the hunter's sights. "You have a leak in your machine, Chairman," Carter continued, his charismatic dominance filling the hangar. "Or maybe you're the only one who doesn't realize the machine has a new owner." Ji-Hoon looked away, unable to meet the chairman's gaze, his furrowed brow revealing the shades of gray he was still struggling to navigate. Kang stood in the rain, his dominant posture challenged for the first time by an unexpected equal who already held the upper hand. The strategic war had moved from the boardroom to the street, and the chairman realized with a sinking shock that he was no longer the one making the moves. The penthouse suite of the Grand Beaumont was a clinical vacuum of high-end luxury, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a Detroit skyline that bled red and blue into the dark. Chairman Kang Min-Jae sat in a low-slung velvet chair, his tailored black suit sharp against the gold leaf accents of the room, his posture a study in controlled tension. Across from him, Malcolm Black Crown Carter leaned back with a quiet superiority, his upright, confident posture suggesting he was the landlord of this entire encounter. Between them sat Park Ji-Hoon, his face partially obscured by the split lighting of the room, sweat beading on his forehead as he held a phone that felt like a detonator. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the strategic intelligence of two master chess players. Kang's jawline remained defined, his cold eyes focused on the unexpected equal who had successfully dismantled his board of directors from across an ocean. He had come to America to handle things personally, believing he could still shut down the Black Crown like a common Russian thug. But as the minutes ticked by in the heavy silence, the chairman realized the shades of gray in this city were far darker than he had calculated. "You have flawless taste in hotels, Chairman," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to fill the room. He adjusted the thick gold chain at his neck, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he looked at the stone-faced Korean bodyguards lining the walls. "But I think your men are a little tense. Maybe they should step back and enjoy the hospitality." Kang's lead enforcer took a step forward, his hand moving toward the lapel of his suit. The movement was instinctive, a display of territorial dominance intended to remind Carter whose room this was. But before the guard could speak, every television screen in the suite flickered to life, showing a live, high-definition feed of the very room they were standing in. The shadow glitch had returned, but this time it was no hardware failure. The bodyguards froze. On the screens, red thermal signatures highlighted the specialized microphones and pinhole cameras hidden in the crown molding and the light fixtures, devices that hadn't been there when Kang's sweep team cleared the floor. The realization hit the Korean detail like a physical blow. They weren't just being watched, they were being broadcast. Carter's hackers hadn't just leaked the chairman's arrival, they had wired his sanctuary against him before he even checked in. "Step back," Kang commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. His men hesitated, then slowly retreated toward the shadows of the foyer, their muscles rendered useless by the digital trap. The chairman looked at Ji-Hoon, who was staring at the floor, his brows furrowed in a mask of anxiety and fear. "You see, Chairman, in my city, the surveillance systems are to protect my property, not yours." Carter leaned forward, his charismatic dominance filling the vacuum left by the bodyguards. "You thought you were the only one who could play the chess player. But while you were looking at the board, I was rewiring the table." The clinical silence returned, but it was now weaponized. Kang realized with a jolt of controlled tension that he was no longer the hunter. He was the primary witness to his own obsolescence. Malcolm Carter wasn't just a drug lord. He was the ghost in the chairman's machine. "So," Carter whispered, his expression assured as he gestured to the glowing monitors. "Should we start with business, or do you want to keep watching the show?" The high-end hotel suite was thick with the scent of aged cedar and the cold, clinical vibration of a machine finally coming to a halt. Chairman Kang Min-Jae remained in his chair, his tailored black suit a shadow against the gold leaf accents, his jawline tight, with a controlled tension that bordered on physical pain. He watched as Park Ji-Hoon, the spy he had raised from the streets of Seoul, slowly stood and walked across the room, not to the chairman's side, but to the warm golden light surrounding Malcolm Carter. It was the ultimate betrayal, the movement of a piece that Kang had once believed was his most stable variable. Ji-Hoon's face was partially lit in the split red and blue glow of the monitors, his brows no longer furrowed with the anxiety of a runner, but set in a mask of grim, dual allegiance. He reached into his coat and produced a secure, encrypted smartphone, his fingers steady as he tapped a final command. With a silent, deferential nod to the Black Crown, he stepped forward and placed the device on the table directly in front of Kang. "The board is in session, Chairman," Ji-Hoon whispered, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of a decade of service being discarded. Kang looked at the phone. The screen displayed a secure conference linked to the syndicate's boardroom in Seoul. He saw the faces of his high-ranking directors, men who had sworn a false sense of loyalty to him for years, men who were now radiating a quiet superiority of their own. They weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They were sitting in the light Carter had bought for them. "Chairman Kang," the senior director began, his voice tinny but cold through the speaker. "In light of the recent leaks regarding the mule contracts and the personal risk your leadership now poses to our international capital, we have reached a unanimous decision." Malcolm Carter leaned forward, his posture upright and assured, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he watched the chess player realize he had been checkmated by his own pawns. The charismatic dominance of the drug lord filled the room, making the air feel heavy and scarce. "You're being cleaned out, Chairman," Carter said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "Fair and square. We are voting for your immediate removal," the director continued from the phone. "Effective as of this moment, all your assets, codes, and territorial dominance are being transferred to the oversight of the Black Crown Group. We thank you for your years of strategic intelligence, but the market has moved on." Kang stared at the screen, his eyes cold and focused, yet for the first time, they held a flicker of genuine shock. He had spent his life viewing people as pieces on a board, believing that his clean and marked power was absolute. He had ignored the shades of gray until they had swallowed him whole. The very board he thought he owned had been the ghost in his machine, waiting for Carter to give the signal to shut him down. Ji-Hoon didn't look away this time. He stood by Carter's side, a silent witness to the destruction of the man who had found him only to use him as a tool for organ harvesting and trafficking. The strategic war was over, and the chairman was left holding a phone that was already going dead. The room was losing its red neon pulse, replaced entirely by the warm, deceptive gold of Carter's empire. "It's a business decision, Kang," Carter whispered, his expression assured. "And I know you like my candy, too." The clinical, high-end silence of the Grand Beaumont suite was no longer the silence of a command center, it was the silence of a tomb. Chairman Kang Min-Jae sat motionless, his tailored black suit a dark void against the gold leaf accents that now belonged to another man. The phone on the table had gone black, the digital tether to his board of directors severed after their final, chilling vote to strip him of his territorial dominance. He was no longer the chess player. He was a relic, a piece removed from a board that had been rewired from beneath him. Malcolm, Black Crown Carter stood over him, radiating an assured, charismatic dominance that made the air in the room feel heavy and scarce. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't need to. The strategic war had been won with candy and shadow glitches, not bullets. Carter reached for the crystal decanter, the thick gold chain at his neck catching the warm golden lighting of the room as he poured a single glass of amber liquid. "You see, Chairman, the problem with muscles is they make you slow. And the problem with arrogance is it makes you blind." Carter pushed the glass across the mahogany table until it tapped against the chairman's hand. "I'm leaving you alive. Not out of hospitality, but because a ghost is more useful to me than a martyr." Kang's eyes, once cold and focused with strategic intelligence, now held only a hollow, controlled tension. He looked at Park Ji-Hoon, who stood at Carter's side. The spy's face was no longer a mask of anxiety and fear. The unstable variable had finally found a side in the shades of gray, even if that side was just as dirty as the one he had left. "You think you've won," Kang whispered, his voice a low vibration of strict authority. "But the market is a machine that eventually harvests everyone." Carter offered a subtle, confident smirk, his posture upright and assured. He leaned down, his face inches from the man who had tried to treat him like just another Russian to be shut down. "Maybe. But today, I'm the one who owns the machine. And you? You're just a signature on a few leaked contracts that I might decide to share with the feds if you ever try to move a piece again." The chairman looked at the glass, the liquid reflecting the red and blue sirens of the city below, a city that was now a Black Crown territory. He realized the shock was total. His bank accounts were drained, his board had defected, and his most loyal weapon was now his jailer. He was powerless, a ghost in the machine who had been deleted from his own life. "Trust me on this, Chairman," Carter said, his voice dropping to a melodic, lethal whisper as he turned to walk toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You're done." Ji-Hoon followed Carter, leaving Kang alone in the shimmering gold of the penthouse. The new order had begun, and the only thing left for the former chairman was the bitter taste of a drink he hadn't asked for and a game he would never play again.